So my name is Damian Kastbauer, and I'm a technical sound designer for games. Essentially, serve as a conduit between people who are making content, sound content, and the game engine itself, and kind of tying those things together and making them work right. Really, there was a moment of epiphany when I was just getting started figuring out what this whole game audio thing really meant. And I had made some music that was totally outside of my experience and created some sounds, passed them off to the developer, and received a build back, and wasn't exactly playing back the way that I expected. It was kind of the tails on the sounds were getting cut off every time the repetition would come around, and I realized pretty quickly that there was more to, a sound sounding good than just making it sound good. There was a whole other layer in play, and there was a programmer at the time who was very gracious and talked me through what was happening, and for me, that inspiration of understanding that there was this, at the time, kind of hidden layer of implementation between creating the sound and it playing back in the game became kind of the jumping off point for me, where I ended up moving on from content creation to just the pure playback of sounds and building mechanisms for the playback of sounds using a game. And so when I realized that that was really where my passion was, I kind of dove right into it. And I guess because I liked it so much, it's kind of all I wanted to do. And at the time, it was a little bit odd to have someone who just did implementation. It wasn't really a career path that was defined within the industry so much. A lot of times the implementer was a sound designer or composer who was on their way to becoming a content creator. They kind of had to do this thing on the way to kind of understand how games worked, and it was more seen as an entry-level gig on the way to being something else. And for me, it's kind of all I wanted to do. And so I grabbed Rob's moniker and kind of hung that technical sound designer title around my head and just focused hard on systems for playback of sound and how to make sound sound good in the game. So implementation is simply the playback of sounds in the game using a prescribed set of rules. And the simple explanation of it is to play a sound. The game says play it, and the sound plays back. To get that sound to play back requires implementation. On one level, there's a programming layer of it. You have to have an audio engine to play back the sound. But then even just simpler than that, you have to tell that audio engine when it's requested what sound to play back. So that it's that middle piece between the programming and the content where implementation basically facilitates the playback of that sound. And now that grows into a bigger, crazier mess when you're talking about systems for playback. Complex systems for physics or for vehicles or for ambient. You can build complexities into that in order to play back many sounds in various different ways according to a lot of different rules. But at its root, it is simply, tying together the game with the sound in a human way. So a great simple example of implementation working with gameplay to provide and support the experience of the game was in Geometry Wars. So Geometry Wars is a top-down shoot 'em up, and while you're taking care of enemies and dispatching them with your laser beams, the music is pulsing and the sound is happening, and as soon as you drop a bomb, the entire mix gets a low-pass filter applied to it for a period of time, where then the envelope on that filter opens up and the mayhem resumes in full fidelity and frequency. And to me, what that does is it not only highlights and accentuates the power of that moment for the player, but also takes sound on that journey with the experience and really just supports how awesome that was. And so there's one good example of how that simple trick of adding DSP to that gameplay moment in a way that enhanced and supported the gameplay is a way that implementation can really be used to make something feel good. The hardest part about implementation is iteration and the constantly striving for the best representation and feedback to the player. And I guess coming to terms with the fact that there's going to be a lot of iteration when you're trying to leverage the gameplay in a way that feels right. And I think of implementation a lot of times in feel, by feel, and using this idea of feel, because it is not so much it's not about the right sound, but it's about the right presentation of the sound. And so a lot of times it's simply shuffling values in a playback system that will take the sound of a system from being something that could be overly repetitive or clunky to being smooth and dynamic. And so I find that a lot of times it's that constant drive to iterate and push forward towards supporting the game with the right feeling and having the sounds fall into place appropriately. It's also the joy, right? Because in a lot of ways, we're never satisfied until it ships. And in this day and age of live service, we often have the bonus round of being able to continue massaging these systems even after it launches. So I guess we're our own worst enemies in that regard. It's both the hardest and the most satisfying in that way. But at the end of the day, I think you know that you've succeeded when you feel like the sound is supporting what is happening on screen and it supports the player's experience. It's usually pretty fundamental to the role of a technical sound designer to be working directly with the content creators. As you're building the system as the technical sound designer, you understand more clearly what the game has for you to leverage, the kind of either parameters or functionality. So knowing those things allow you to, begin with a preliminary system, which then you specify to content creators the elemental pieces that will build up that system. And it's almost like they're designing the palette, this audio palette for it. And so extremely deeply, on a deep level, you have to have that ability to communicate what the game is doing, the system you're creating and how that will interact with it, and then also what kinds of sounds will work within it. Whether it's, I think the best example is taking a physics system, which is going to have different sized sounds. It's going to have different material types. And depending on the game, you're going to have this spectrum of tiny elements that will combine into becoming the sound of the physical world as it interacts. And it's a place where there absolutely needs to be a clear line drawn between how the game is working, how the implementation system is working, and then how the content is created for that system to support the game. So a lot of times it's the best part of the collaboration. I think that when I'm doing my job right, what's happening is that I'm preparing for that by getting a system in place using whatever I have available content-wise, whether it's just, tiny little pieces of audio, or something that's created specifically for it, something to stand up the system so that it's at least dancing a little bit, to understand how the game as the playback device really kind of gets it talking. And then once you understand a bit of that interaction between the game and the system, you have a better idea of how to iterate it, and how to iterate the system to be more fluid or to support what's happening better. But then you also have that the next phase where the content creators can come in and create content for the system. And if I'm doing it right, again, I've taken these steps in advance as a preparation for that content creation phase. And for me, I think a lot of work can get done up front in establishing these kind of systems, which then I feel like makes that collaboration between the content creators so rich, because you understand deeply what the intention is. And it's great because it leverages people's specialties, people who are fantastic at making crumbling material sounds, and just love, driving out into the desert or their backyard and, breaking things, can do what they love. And I get the greatest joy in taking their work and seeing how that ends up being played back by the game using the system. So for me, it's the joy of discovery as I'm kind of taking this journey with the game or with the system, because once the content goes into it, it's like the paint on the canvas, and it comes alive with someone else's beautiful content. So it's a deep collaboration for sure. It's the rare developer that really understands sound and how to use it in a game fundamentally. And so I think that as professionals, we're always trying to, make I think we're always trying to find a way to bring people into our craft and bring people towards a better understanding of what we do, while simultaneously, building the trust to be able to do that. And so one of the ways to do that is, explaining the process a bit and getting buy-in. That's either through, the prototyping of systems, or even the creation of a blue sky type linear video and audio representation. Some kind of target towards where we're trying to bring the sound or the system. And it's definitely a relationship that you have with a developer as a freelancer that becomes the kind of thing that enables you to do what you want to do. So having that trust is something that you find the best way to build. Right? Well, so it's interesting, right? Because stepping into my career in game audio initially was as a freelancer, and my first job was through Bay Area Sound, and it was a 6-month contract with a developer in Northern California. And right out of the gate, I was dropped into the last months of production on a game, and essentially spent the next 7 years of my freelance life in the industry, helping to take the pressure off of developers in the final phases of their game. The tiny niche of technical sound design that I had fallen into became something that developers found value in towards the end of their development cycle, when they had less and less time, but had more and more need. And I think that it was at that time, and even today, probably easier and more common to find someone who made really cool sounds than it was to find someone who could slide into the middle of things and connect the dots between the sounds and what were many times proprietary game engines, potentially with proprietary audio solutions. And so that niche that I fell into ended up being super awesome, because it was all I wanted to do, was help great content creators get their sounds in games sounding great. So it was awesome, and I would jump around from different studios and help them find their games. One of the games that I helped with was Dead Space 3, and I worked on that game for 3 months at the end of their production. And you're working with a team of superstars, right? These are people who have lived with the project for a year or two. They know their way in and out, and you're really there to help support their vision for the audio and find a way to enable these ideas that have been burning them to the core that they haven't been able to execute on yet. And so you very quickly have to get ramped up with their vision for things, the tool sets in place to do the work, and how to be as effective as possible with as little guidance as you can. And so Dead Space 3 was a great example of a superstar team with a really clear vision and an entire suite of proprietary tool sets. And so, step one, learn everything you can about how they're wiring up sound. Step number 2, understand what the creative vision is, and, figure out who the content creators are so that you can start those relationships. Step 3, inventory every door in the game and make sure that they all play the right sounds when they open, and that on either side of the door the correct ambience plays. And I think if anyone's played Dead Space before, it's like that spreadsheet at the end of the day ended up being 350 doors worth. And they all had to be verified and unified after a year and a half of development, which was a a formal task, but the kind of thing that needed to happen in order to give consistency to the overall world, right? And so that was the kind of stuff I love to bite off, right? And they say, oh, we just don't know what happened. It's been a year and a half, and some doors work, some doors sound right, and some ambiences don't work, and some of them don't sound right. And for me, that's a dream job, because I guess it puts into play an organizational kind of methodology that really just lets me go to town within the confines of that development. So that was a great one. Other things like working on Uncharted 3. They had a super elaborate physics system to handle the interactions of sounds between objects. And stepping into the project after understanding the tool sets, again, proprietary tool sets within Naughty Dog, and created specifically for Uncharted 3. And first of all, what does this button do? And how do these things work? And so after ramping up with the tools and understanding from the team what their vision for these things were, stepping into a world that is alive with physics objects that each, in a lot of cases, need to have their own unique sounds, but in a lot of cases could also potentially share sounds between different objects, whether it's a small, medium, or large wooden crate. How can we take a single content set for crates and use DSP to pitch or volume or filter the variations in order to get change based on the size of the object. Again, the goal being smaller footprint of audio memory, the goal being high level of variation, and a world full of objects and material types. So similar to Dead Space 3, the role there was inventory all of the objects in the game. Find out where we can share content across different objects. Find out what specific content we need and make sure that a creator can get that over. And so I think it organizationally becomes, the challenge of that is kind of the fun. So things have changed now being an in-house employee, because instead of jumping in and out of tool sets, game engines, and pipelines, I have the consistency of maintaining a single pipeline for longer duration. And in the game I'm working on now, as a live service, it's a game that has already shipped. It's a game that continues to add content and iterate. And so the challenge is completely opposite. Every 3 or 6 months, I don't have to learn a new tool set. And I'm really able to understand the pipeline and how audio goes in the game, and really able to kind of I can really get my arms around the task at hand, right? And so in that way, it becomes less about designing the systems. The systems have been designed for the most part. We might get some new stuff here and there. It becomes less about designing the systems and more about iterating the systems over time, and then about adding new content to those systems as we move forward. And so what's kind of nice about being in-house now is the consistency of the pipeline and just the known quantity of the work. Whereas as a freelancer, it was, a little bit wild. So So I really enjoyed that about being in-house. The people I work with are extremely supportive. They're really able to give good feedback, and I have there's a lot of value working directly with the team. And so, again, as a freelancer, sometimes I was on site, sometimes I was off site, always with that connection to the team. But the times on site were definitely the times when there was the best communication. I think anyone would agree with that. And so I've really just kind of reveled in that. I love, taking a step away from my desk and slinging a guitar over my shoulder and walking around and feeling the pulse of the team. For me, that's a twofold thing. One, it keeps them aware that I'm around. I think audio has a habit of getting locked away in the soundproof room. But also, I can usually catch some good conversations that have a rippling effect and will come down the pipeline to me eventually, as long as I'm around, aware, and able to. So that's been a really nice side benefit too. I used to spend a couple of months, let's say, just finessing and iterating on a system for a giant game. On Star Wars, they brought in this technology called digital molecular matter. And it was this untested, unproven, physical simulation. And it was not, it was untested and completely brand new. And jumping into something like that took research, experimentation, and some pretty deep knob twiddling. Whereas now what I find myself doing is, again, in an established pipeline, iterating on a theme. And for me now, it's more about that collaboration with the content creators, because the systems have been established for the most part. And so that's the big difference for me, is that on a larger scale game, you might have someone on the team who only handles physics. You might have someone on a team who only handles the vehicles or the combat. Whereas what's kind of fun now is I can do it all for the game, because it's a much tinier, compartmentalized, known quantity. And so I'm really enjoying kind of having that more global purview for a smaller title. That said, really did love big systems and the amount of tuning that goes into that. So those are kind of the two, for me, that's the difference right now in how I've made that transition. Mobile games are great too, because the other thing that I've found is that coming from console games, so many of the same tricks that we were doing on a 360 or a PS3 directly translate now to the mobile space. And once upon a time, mobile was bound by the constraints of the platform, low memory, low CPU. But really, we're doing many of the same things across mobile, which means we can do all the fun things that we have been doing. And so I guess in some ways, I haven't really lost anything moving to mobile, which may be surprising for some people. But it's because of the scope of the games as well, right? So as the scope has gotten smaller, so have the, let's see. I mean, as the scope's gotten smaller, it's not like the imagination has gotten smaller in comparison. I think the imagination is even larger for mobile titles in a lot of ways, certainly more varied. And so I think fundamentally, if you have all of the same tools, you can do all kinds of fun stuff. So, and that's, I guess, maybe to the point as well, is in the last 5 or 10 years, the audio middleware tools consistency has been just a boon to the technical sound designer's workflow. Having the ability to step into a tool set that's established, that's understood, and that you can talk with colleagues about and share a language has been an incredible step up from a time when the tools lived behind closed doors and NDAs. And so it's really come into its own. And again, this was something that was happening about the time I transitioned to game audio, and kind of amazingly so. I feel really lucky to have kind of rode that wave as things have become more established in audio middleware. The capabilities are things that transfer from project to project. And again, when I say the same tricks that I was doing on console games, I can now apply to mobile, and that's down to a tool set as well, right? It's that I don't have to limit my implementation because of a lack of CPU or resources. I can really just do the same kinds of things within the budget. So tools have been kind of an impressive change in the industry from the way it was, because I remember stepping into weird projects with weird tools, and it's nice. Peggle 2 was a great experience. Stepping into the project, a lot of work had been done already to build on the past success of the first Peggle. And Guy had already stepped in and established his system for music. And a lot of times my role was and is facilitating someone like Guy with achieving their idea of sound or music for the game. And so what was it? Well, a lot of times it was just the behind the curtains, making sure things were dancing the way they were supposed to. One example is there was an idea that, hey, we've got this music happening, it's tempo matched, and we have this idea of beats and bars. Can we use that anywhere else? Can we apply that creatively to kind of support what else is happening? And we'd already taken a step forward and created ambient beds and one-shots of different creatures throughout the worlds. And it was a pretty straightforward step to move that into the idea of a rhythm-based playback of those elements. Again, once everything kind of locks into the groove of the music, you don't notice it so much. It's subtle, but it does kind of add to the magic and joy of things. And so a lot of times it was trying to connect the dots between things that we were already doing and how to make them even more integrated with either the sound and music that was happening or with the gameplay that was happening. So a lot of times my job was a facilitator to, tie things together interactively to support the game that was happening. And what a great opportunity. That's a game that just has baked into its DNA all of these opportunities for joy. And I think having sound supporting that, kind of an easy win in a lot of ways. I remember one challenge though where we had built this elaborate music system based on guys' compositions, and we crossed the bridge of multiplayer for the first time. And within the audio engine and tool set, we had built kind of a monster of a music system. And when it came time to handle multiplayer music, which was going to be represented by 4 players on the screen, and gave the player the ability to switch between different players' boards, we decided that it'd be cool if you could hear their music and their peg hits at the same time. And essentially what that ended up being was that we took this gigantic music system that we had created for the single player experience, and we just did it 4 times. And so this was a huge technical challenge, and historically may not have flown, but at the time we just went for it, and it paid off because the experience of being able to change between views and hear the music reacting dynamically like that was definitely a great experience for the player. And you wouldn't necessarily think it, because if it was just 4 tracks of music and you were switching between 4 tracks, that's kind of okay, no big deal. But because of the complexity of these systems, I think there was a little bit of trepidation on our part that, maybe that's not going to go so well. And plenty of challenges, don't get me wrong. But it was a huge technical hurdle to jump over. And so a lot of times that's the role of someone in a technical sound design or even implementation position, is just to help people leap over those technological hurdles and deliver on the experience they're trying to create. I think if I could riff a little bit on this idea of community and giving things back and this kind of circular flow, I think one of the things that really helped me stepping into game audio from where I was, right, it was this, for me, a weird combination of rock and roll and video games, right? Growing up with an Atari and a Nintendo, and then discovering weird noise as a teenager. And then somehow that all added up to game audio as a career, at some point. And I think once I acknowledged that as where my passion was, it became clear to me that that's kind of what I had to do. And the road to that was not really very clear. But I felt like what I had the ability to share my experience. Age of the blog and the forum and the social media, just put in my hands a tool set to be able to contribute to what was happening by talking about what I was going through as I found my way towards a career, and invaluable insight gained from people throughout that time, which helped me build this idea of who it was I wanted to be in the industry. And so I guess I never felt like I was doing myself a disservice, and I still don't as a professional, by sharing my experience in game audio. And so I can't help but feel like that played a partial role in my ability to do what it is that I do today. By writing articles, by doing podcasts, by having conversations. And it is that kind of community building advocacy outside of myself as a way to try and grow this idea of game audio that really has been fundamental to my growth, I feel like. And no one can ever follow in another's footsteps directly, but if there's anything that I would say about making your way towards a career in game audio, it's just that you will get back what you give, and you have something to share. So finding a way to share it, finding a way to be a part of this industry is kind of to the core of the future of game audio. So I like that a lot. That was one thing I wanted to say.
Well, that's great. I mean, it's been really great to watch you go from, the guy who was working in the halls of residence in Minnesota, trying to get into this world, and now you're like the guru for all of these other people trying to get into this world.
I wouldn't go that far, but it's, again, I think I have been unafraid to put myself out there as not knowing anything, and have been open to people's, people sharing their intelligence, right? And I feel like through that combined, give and take of sharing and listening, it just has, it's worked out good for me. And I guess, that builds, for me, that has built a strong career. So it is funny though how that happened, right? It's like one day I got all the time in the world, the web at my fingertips, at a dead-end job with no credits and nothing to show for it. And, through a long process of, putting myself out there, meeting people, trying to be kind, it has resulted, I'd like to think, a little bit in where I am today. So it's great. Again, I think the people that I've met along the way have all, put things in my ears to make me sound a lot smarter than I am. And so I'm thankful to them for sharing that dialogue and having that dialogue. I think without the support of various people throughout that time, I think everyone needs a little support once in a while. So it's been good.